Hi, I'm Marcel. I'm 66 years old, and my son decided I should pay his wife's mortgage, not help them with a loan, not co-sign, not offer advice. Just pay it. $17,000. And when I refused, they sued me for even more. But that's not the part that broke me. It was the silence before it, the years of quiet dismissal, the unspoken belief that I existed only to fund their lives. They took my name, my dog, my dignity, and then they brought me to court. What kind of family does that to their mother? Would yours? Spring had barely brushed Missouri with green when the envelope arrived. A simple card in the mailbox from my son Trenton, written in Callista's cursive. We'd love for you to join us for Callista's birthday dinner. Just us, Saturday night. There was no time, no location beyond the house. But I knew what that meant. The house they moved into last year. The one I hadn't been invited to since the day I helped hang their curtains. I held the card longer than I needed to, standing by the mailbox, letting the wind tug at my coat. There'd been a time when I would have been thrilled, but that time lived with a version of me that still believed invitations meant inclusion. I spent that Saturday preparing like it was something, set out a blouse I hadn't worn in over a year, curled my hair, though the mirror offered no promises. By 6, I was parked in their driveway, staring at their door, still deciding whether to knock or drive off. When Callista opened it, all teeth and perfect waves, her voice reached a little too high. "Marcel, oh my gosh, you came!" Trenton appeared behind her, wine already in hand, smile just this side of forced. "Hey, Ma." The dining room was bright, too bright. I noticed my place at the table was already set, but with a plastic knife, not silverware like the others. I sat down quietly, hands in my lap, listening to them swap stories with friends I didn't recognize. No one asked how I was doing. No one noticed I hadn't spoken. After dinner, chicken cordon bleu, too salty. Trenton stood and clinked his glass. "We have a little surprise." Callista pulled out a gold envelope and handed it to me, eyes gleaming. "We thought this would be the perfect time," she said, "to honor someone who's always been there." I hesitated. The room fell quiet as I opened it. Inside, a mortgage agreement, 30 pages, my name, my address, and a payment schedule. "Wait," I said. "What is this?" Trenton grinned, hand on my shoulder. "We found the perfect starter home just outside town. It's in your name for now. We thought you'd want to give this gift to Callista. She's done so much for our family." A ripple of clapping followed. I blinked down at the papers, too stunned to speak. Callista turned to the table. "Isn't she the sweetest?" Most moms would have hesitated, but not Marcel. Always so giving. I forced a smile, lips pressed tight. My heart beat loud in my ears. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to thank them or sign something. Someone passed me a pen. I laid it beside the glass of wine I hadn't touched. "You're amazing," Callista said, reaching for a photo op. "Seriously, this means everything." I smiled again. "Because what else do you do in a room full of people expecting your gratitude?" After most of the guests left, I waited near the hallway while Trenton collected dishes. "What was that?" I asked, barely above a whisper. He didn't look up. "It's not a big deal." "You put a mortgage in my name without asking. You live alone, Ma. You got savings. You don't need much now." I stared at him, this grown man I'd raised with too little and too much. "So you thought you'd spend it for me?" He shrugged. "It's just a loan, a gesture. You should feel proud." The word scraped something raw inside me. You didn't even ask. Would you have said yes? His voice turned sharp. We were trying to make it special. I left without saying goodbye. The ride home was quiet, street lights blurred in the drizzle. I drove slower than usual, not trusting my hands. The envelope sat on the passenger seat, unopened again. I didn't want to see my name printed across something I never chose. At home, I turned on one lamp, made tea, watched it cool. They'd said it was a gift, but standing alone in my kitchen, I knew better. That didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a setup. 3 mornings had passed since that dinner, and I still couldn't shake the feeling that the envelope on my kitchen counter was watching me. I hadn't opened it again, didn't need to. I knew what it said, and I knew what it meant. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have imagined, was that the damage from that night hadn't ended when I walked out their front door. I was halfway through buttering a slice of toast when my phone buzzed. It was a text from Marlene, my neighbor 3 houses down. She never texts unless it's about trash day or a lost cat. You might want to check Facebook. My thumb hovered over the app. Something inside me said not to look, but I tapped anyway. There it was, a video post, uploaded by Callista, already shared hundreds of times. The thumbnail was a still of me mid-sentence, my mouth half open, eyes squinting under the dining room light. The caption read, "When your MEL attacks you for wanting a home." I tapped play. It was a montage, edited clips from the birthday dinner. Me looking confused, me not smiling, me holding the mortgage papers in my lap. Her voice narrated over soft piano music. We were just trying to celebrate, and she couldn't handle it. I felt my cheeks flush hot, my stomach twist. The comment section was a battlefield I hadn't signed up for. Strangers called me bitter, entitled. One even said, "Looks like she's been holding her son hostage emotionally for years." I locked my phone, but the heat didn't leave my face. By noon, I noticed a change in the way people looked at me. At the grocery store, the young cashier, who always chatted with me about her garden, was suddenly quiet, barely looked up as she rang up my eggs and milk. When I waved to the couple walking their dog past my porch, they pretended not to see me. Even my mailman, Pete, who once spent 10 minutes telling me about his grandkid's spelling bee, just dropped the letters and walked off without a word. And then, around 4 that afternoon, Callista showed up at my door. She didn't knock. She just opened the gate and stepped onto my porch like she lived there. "I hope this isn't a bad time," she said, like she cared. She didn't wait for me to answer. "Trenton's really upset. He's having trouble sleeping, and Charlie barking all night isn't helping." My heart caught. "Charlie?" She folded her arms like this was a conversation she'd rehearsed. "I think it would be best for everyone if I took him for a while, just until things settle down." I blinked. "You want to take my dog?" She smiled tightly. "Just for a few weeks. He needs a calm environment, and right now, you're a little overwhelmed." Before I could say no, she knelt and unhooked the leash from the wall. Charlie, poor thing, wagged his tail, not knowing what this meant. "Be a good boy," she cooed, leading him down the steps, and then they were gone. The silence that followed didn't feel like peace. It felt like vacuumed air. I stood in the hallway for a while, unsure what to do with my hands. The leash dangled from my fingertips like some kind of betrayal. I sat down that evening in the armchair by the window, the one Charlie always curled beside. The ache in my chest wasn't loud. It was slow, like sinking into cold water. That dog was the last living soul in this town that looked at me with kindness. He didn't care about social media or mortgages or optics. He just knew when I needed someone to sit quietly with. They'd taken my name. They'd taken my face and turned it into a caricature. And now, they'd taken the one thing that chose me, freely and without demand. I looked down at the empty leash. They've taken everything they could without touching the truth. I didn't go outside that day. There was no need to. Nothing on the calendar. No one expecting me anywhere. The house felt larger without Charlie's soft footsteps trailing behind me. Each creak of the hardwood floor echoed longer than it used to, filling spaces I didn't realize had gone hollow. I made coffee I didn't drink, rearranged a drawer I hadn't opened in months. That silence didn't comfort. It wasn't peace. It was a verdict. Somewhere between clearing the table and folding a dish towel, I remembered I hadn't paid the utility bill. The paper one. I always kept those in the hall cabinet. I reached for the small metal box labeled House. It was where I stored warranties, receipts, and old birthday cards Trenton had written before Callista taught him to forget. Under a stack of appliance manuals, I found a worn notebook, soft blue cover, stickers on the front. I sat down on the floor and turned the first page. Trenton Summer Journal, age 10. The handwriting was uneven, big loops and crooked lines, but legible. I flipped through drawings of rockets, bad jokes about math, one tragic attempt at a poem. Then I stopped. One day I'll buy Mom a house with a garden so she never has to work again. I read it 3 times. 4. The ink had faded, but the promise was as loud as ever. I closed the book slowly. The garden. That garden. I'd spent years tending it alone, waiting for some sign of that boy who once drew houses for me on napkins and promised me things with his whole heart. Peonies, tomatoes, rows of basil, all for the someday that never showed up. He didn't even notice when I stopped planting. It was nearing late afternoon when I decided to pull out the photo albums, not out of nostalgia, but habit. It was the kind of day when your fingers just want to touch something real. I sat on the edge of my bed and flipped open the big leather-bound one labeled Family. There we were, 4th of July at Table Rock Lake, my arm around Trenton, sunburned, smiling. I recognized the photo. It was one Callista had posted on Facebook 2 months ago with a caption about family legacies. But when I checked her page again, still open on my tablet from my last doom scroll, I saw it had been edited, my face cropped, the same photo just zoomed in, as if I'd never been there. It wasn't just cruel, it was surgical, intentional. I closed the album and sat still for a long time. The windows had dimmed without me noticing. Shadows stretched across the living room floor like quiet accusations. I didn't cry. I'd cried too many times over things like this, little wounds that felt like paper cuts until they started to bleed. Instead, I stood. I walked to the mantel where another photo sat, a candid one, me and Charlie sitting on the porch, his head on my lap, eyes half closed. I took the family photo down, put that one up in its place. He never cropped me out. I didn't need to keep pictures that pretended I was never part of the story. By evening, I had folded the old journal and tucked it back into the box, but this time on top, a reminder, not of a promise kept, but of what had once been real. I walked through the kitchen slowly, fingers tracing the edge of the counter, and stood in the doorway where Charlie used to wait for me with patient eyes and a wagging tail. I raised a son who once dreamed of giving me a home. I whispered. But somehow, I ended up being the one they wanted to evict from their story. I heard the mail carrier long before I saw the envelope. The sound of the lid on my mailbox slamming shut was sharper than usual, like a judge's gavel. I waited until his truck had disappeared down the street before I opened the door. There it was, resting atop the stack of grocery coupons and utility bills. A thick white envelope with a printed label. No return address, but the logo in the corner gave it away. A law firm. I brought it inside, setting it on the table like it might explode. My fingers hesitated on the seal. I'd been preparing myself for more fallout, but nothing really softens that kind of blow. When I finally opened it, I pulled out the stack of pages and read the first line aloud. In the matter of Trenton Gage and Callista Ron versus Marcel Duval. My hands trembled. The rest of the language was dense, sharp-edged. They were suing me. $50,000, damages, emotional harm, defamation. I reread the first paragraph. Accused of verbal intimidation, aggressive financial manipulation. I stopped. I laid the papers down and walked to the sink, ran cold water, didn't drink it, just stared out the window at the weeds that had crept into my flower beds. Being sued by strangers would have hurt less, but by my son, my own blood, who used to fall asleep with his head on my lap while I read him stories about loyalty and trust. The pages stayed on the table. I didn't cry, but something inside me retreated. Later, I tucked the envelope into the back of my desk drawer and stepped outside. My knees cracked as I crouched in the garden, pulling at the roots that had gone wild since winter. I pressed my palms into the dirt and let it hold me up. My breathing slowed. That's where it hit. Not with sobs, not with screams, but a hollowness that made my limbs feel numb. A memory came back to me. Trenton at 12, falling off his bike and skinning his knees. He cried for me then. Now, he wanted the court to take from me what little peace I had left. The next morning, just as the light began to fill the kitchen, the phone rang. I let it go to voicemail, but the number showed up on caller ID, Midwest Valley Credit Union. I called back, and after a polite shuffle through departments, a voice came on. Mrs. Duval, we're reaching out because your account has been flagged for review. There was a complaint filed citing concerns about potential financial instability. Standard procedure requires us to place a temporary hold on large outgoing transfers. My throat dried. Who filed the complaint? I'm sorry, that information's confidential. Of course it was. I ended the call, sat down slowly, and placed my hand on my chest. It wasn't a heart attack, but it didn't feel far from it. They weren't just trying to humiliate me anymore. They were trying to erase me, undermine my name, my finances, my standing. And for what? A mortgage? Control? Or just because they could? Later that day, after the shaking subsided, I made tea. Stronger than usual. Then I took out a blank sheet of paper, not to write back, not to respond formally, just to get the words out of my head. You've drawn your line, I wrote. I'll draw mine. And so I began gathering everything. Copies of the mortgage document, bank statements, the tax returns I'd filed every year on time, alone, without help, the journal I found in the drawer, the photo they cropped me out of. They thought they knew the story. They thought they could narrate me out of it. But I had the archives. I had my memory. I stood in the hallway, watching the light dim as the sun slipped behind the fence line. For the first time in a while, I didn't feel like retreating. I looked at the last line I'd written. They may think I won't fight, but they forget who raised that boy. The message came while I was watering the basil by the kitchen window. It was Loretta, my cousin on my father's side, the one who always called with church gossip and offers of lemon pound cake after holidays. This time, her voice cracked through the static like she was holding a fragile truth. Marcel, I hate to ask, but did you ever hit Trenton? People are saying, someone said something about bruises. I didn't answer at first. The hose kept running until the soil was dark and overflowing. No, I said, barely above a whisper. Not once. She hesitated. Okay, I thought so, but you know how it spreads. I just wanted to hear it from you. I stood there a long time after we hung up, staring at the overwatered plants, as if they could confirm what I knew. They were making me into a monster, and the people I grew up with, people who had eaten my cooking, seen Trenton grow from a quiet baby into a boy who built Lego cities on my living room floor, were beginning to believe it. Later that afternoon, I sat down with the legal packet again. I read it slower this time, each word anchoring into my stomach like lead. Toward the back, in the witness section, were 4 names I hadn't expected. Cheryl, Naomi, Aunt Brenda, and Martin, all family, all listed as having knowledge of my pattern of controlling behavior. I hadn't spoken to Martin in 10 years. Cheryl sent me a Christmas card once, 3 years ago, and there they were, folded into the narrative, signed and sealed. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. I just stared at the paper and whispered. They didn't even call me first. The next day, I went out for milk and eggs. At the corner store, the air felt different, thicker. A woman I didn't know glanced at me, then leaned toward the man she was with. His eyes locked with mine for a second before dropping to the floor. The cashier, a teenager I joked with just last week, rang me up without a word. It wasn't silence anymore. It was verdict. That night, I called Naomi. She answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was careful. Hey, Marcel, I read your name in the affidavit. Yeah, Callista asked us to. She said it was just a formality, that you wouldn't want the attention. We didn't think it was this. You didn't think, I said. No, she whispered. We didn't. There wasn't anything more to say, so I hung up. I didn't sleep. I got up around 2 a.m. and sat at the dining room table with a notebook and my laptop. I opened a folder labeled personal, started a new document and typed account of events, Marcel Duval. Then I wrote dates, messages, names, screenshots, every conversation, every omission, every time I chose peace and they chose convenience. I took screenshots of Callista's posts, printed out copies of Trenton's emails, flagged bank statements showing years of quiet help. It wasn't anger, not anymore. It was method. They wanted to break me in public, but I knew better than to scream in a noise. Let them throw words. I had paper. Let them pose with filters. I had receipts. Somewhere between page 12 and 13, I paused and looked at my hands. They were still steady. I hadn't realized that until just then. I whispered, if they want war, I won't give them fire. I'll give them facts. As dawn broke through the curtains, I reached for my pen again, flipping the page and pressing it down hard so it wouldn't curl. It's not about who speaks the loudest. It's about who writes the truth down first. It was a Thursday when the phone rang, but not the usual chime. This one was sharp, piercing, and long. the kind of tone that makes your hand hover before answering. I knew the number. I hadn't spoken to him in over a year, and even that conversation had ended in silence. But when I picked up and said hello, Donald's voice came through like a draft under a door you thought you'd sealed. Marcel, I didn't want to call, but Trenton reached out. He asked if I'd be willing to contribute context, background, for court. I stood still, one hand on the countertop, the other tightening around the receiver. His voice had the same rhythm it always did when he'd practiced what to say before saying it. Calm, controlled, cowardly. You mean testify, I said. He hesitated, then cleared his throat. Only if necessary. I told him I'd be factual, nothing personal. Funny, I said, considering everything between us has always been personal. He mumbled something else I didn't care to decipher. I hung up before he could continue. The sound of the dial tone stayed with me. That same man I once protected my son from, defended him against, was now putting on a tie and preparing to tell a courtroom what kind of mother I'd been. Not because it was true, but because it was convenient, and probably because it still irked him that I'd left. By Sunday, the courtroom date had been confirmed. I wore navy, clean, pressed, not to impress, but to look like someone who still knew how to hold herself together. The courthouse smelled like stale air and old paperwork. My heels clicked too loudly down the hallway, the sound bouncing off marble like a metronome. Inside the courtroom, Trenton sat beside Callista, two attorneys flanking them like bookends. Callista whispered something in his ear and didn't look my way. Donald was already seated near the back. He didn't stand, didn't even nod. He might as well have been made of cardboard. I sat alone. No lawyer, no family, just me, and a stack of papers in my bag that proved more than any witness could. The judge called the room to order, and the first words out of Trenton's lawyer's mouth were like acid in water. Your Honor, this is a case about generational trauma, emotional exploitation, and financial pressure exerted over decades. My eyebrows raised, but I said nothing. She weaponized her status as a parent, the lawyer continued, gesturing in my direction without looking at me. She made verbal promises. She controlled finances. She instilled a sense of debt in her son, so deep he believed independence meant abandonment. I looked at Trenton. His jaw was set. His hands were folded. He didn't flinch, not once. They went on for 30 minutes, laying out timelines, quoting partial texts, cherry-picking interactions, and painting them with tones I didn't recognize. At one point, they showed a photo of me at the dinner, holding the mortgage document, the same image Callista had used in her little social media show. It was printed in color. Exhibit B. Still, I didn't speak. I watched. I watched how Callista shifted in her seat when timelines didn't quite match up. I noticed how Donald glanced at his notes twice before answering simple questions about our marriage. I made mental notes, subtle contradictions, inconsistencies, small cracks forming under the weight of their own story. You don't raise a child for 30 years and not learn how to read a room. When the judge asked if I wanted to respond, I politely declined, for now. The lawyer raised an eyebrow, perhaps surprised I wasn't ready to bark back. But that's the thing about being underestimated. It buys you time. Back in my kitchen that night, I laid everything out on the table. Bank statements, printed texts, the photo they'd used, but in its full version. One where my hand rested on Trenton's shoulder, not clenched around the envelope like they'd framed it. I didn't bring backup, but I brought memory, and that might be all I need. The envelope came in the second round of discovery. Nothing fancy, just manila and thick, like all the others. But this one was heavier in a way paper alone couldn't explain. I sat at the dining table with a glass of water I wouldn't drink, my reading glasses low on my nose, and I opened it like I was cutting into something sacred. Inside were the new exhibits, clarifications. The attached note said. I flipped through until one file caught my eye. It was a screenshot of a supposed bank transfer. A payment from me to Trenton, dated 3 months prior to the dinner. Labeled as first installment for mortgage support. My name was typed. My bank's logo in the corner. The amount matched the first payment listed on the mortgage Callista handed me that night. But there was one problem. I never made that payment. I picked up the phone and called Miriam, a retired CPA, widow, and one of the sharpest minds I've ever known. She lived 6 blocks over and still read tax code for fun. She arrived 20 minutes later, cardigan and clipboard in hand, her eyes sharp the moment she scanned the document. Marcel, she said, tapping her pen against the margin. This is a forgery. Sloppy, too. Look here, the routing number's missing a digit. And this font, it's not even your bank's. I sat back, exhaling. It was the kind of relief that didn't feel like release, just confirmation that the hole was deeper than I thought. Miriam patted my hand. You're going to want more than me saying that, but don't worry, I know who to call. By late afternoon, I'd seen enough lies printed in black and white. I stepped outside for air, and as I bent to grab the mail, I noticed something wedged between the screen door and frame. A plain white envelope, no return address. Inside was a single printout, a screenshot of a group chat. Trenton, his friends, casual jokes, one-liners about winning the case. She won't fight it, never has. Another reply. Her silence is permission. Let's close this out. And below that, a note handwritten in black ink. You deserve better. I'll testify if you need me. No signature, just the corner torn, like someone had ripped it from a notebook in a rush. I stood on the porch for a long time, that page in one hand, the fake transfer in the other. They thought I wouldn't fight because I hadn't yet. That night, I made lists, names, dates, quotes. I printed the chat thread, scanned the payment file, and created folders on my computer, clearly labeled. I opened a fresh document titled Statement of Events. Marcel Duval. I started typing, slowly at first, then faster. The next morning, I called a law office recommended by Miriam's contact. Yes, I said calmly, I have evidence of fabricated financial records and potential fraud, and I'd like to speak to someone familiar with elder abuse cases. The receptionist didn't pause. We'll have someone ready for you this afternoon. I didn't tell anyone. I dressed in navy again, like court, and I brought copies, physical and digital, of everything. When I laid it all out on the attorney's desk, she didn't interrupt. She flipped pages, scanned screenshots, leaned back. This isn't just family drama, she finally said. This is strategy, coordinated, potentially criminal. I know, I said, and I want it handled. She nodded. We'll file motions to request full banking data from both sides, and we'll introduce this anonymously received evidence as a lead. I nodded, already knowing what came next. They used to think I was just a mother. Now, they're going to learn what else I am. The courthouse smelled like filtered air and polished shoes. I wore the same navy blue suit I'd retired in. The one Trenton once said made me look too serious. It fit better now, like a second skin. I carried a slim folder, nothing else. No handbag, no backup. Silence would be my weapon today, and I intended to wield it clean. The bailiff gave me a nod as I entered. The courtroom was already half full. Trenton sat at the plaintiff's table, Callista next to him, whispering. She turned, looked me dead in the eye, and smiled, one of those slow, deliberate grins that women like her use when they believe they've already won. Trenton didn't look at me. He stared at his hands, fingers locked tight, as if praying for an outcome he hadn't earned. Callista's attorney greeted the judge with the kind of tone used for country club brunches. She rose, hands poised like she'd trained in theater. "Your Honor," she said, "we have additional documentation to introduce today, audio evidence from the evening in question." I didn't blink. My own attorney, young but sharp, stood. "We'd like to submit audio of our own. It's from the same night, same house, but it tells a different story." The judge adjusted her glasses. "Let's hear it." A laptop was wheeled in. The courtroom hushed, and then Callista's voice crackled through the speakers, clear as wind chimes in a storm. "She'll pay. Trust me. She's too old to fight back. We'll frame it like a gift, and she'll eat it up." Gasps floated around the room like smoke. Even Trenton's attorney shifted uncomfortably. Callista paled. I sat still. The judge's pen froze mid-note. She looked up slowly. "Ms. Rane, do you acknowledge this is your voice?" Callista opened her mouth, then closed it. I was venting. That was taken out of context." Trenton squirmed beside her. I could see his temple pulse. Then came the moment none of us expected. They called Junie. The idea was probably to soften the room. A sweet little girl, answering simple questions, reminding the jury of the family being torn apart. But children are funny creatures. They remember what adults forget to bury. The bailiff guided her to the stand. She swung her feet beneath the chair. "Junie," the attorney said gently, "did your grandmother ever talk about money at the party?" Junie tilted her head. "No." "Did she seem upset?" Junie thought. "No. Mommy said Grandma was being dramatic, but then she said we needed her to pay, or else we'd lose the house." The silence was instant. The judge straightened. "She said that to you directly?" Junie nodded. "She said Grandma would cave. She always caves." Callista's face went stiff. "Thank you, Junie," the judge said, and signaled for the recess. I exhaled, not loud, just long. In the hallway, my attorney leaned close. "We're filing countersuit. Fraud, harassment, emotional distress. The judge is already drafting a formal inquiry." I nodded. "Good." I didn't see Trenton leave, but I saw Donald. He kept his head down. Callista stormed out 10 minutes later, her heels echoing like gunshots. I waited until the building cleared. I walked out alone. No cameras, no press, no applause, but I carried with me a quiet I hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not retreat, just the quiet pride of someone who defended herself with truth and patience. The week after the hearing was the quietest my house had been in years. Not peaceful, just quiet, like the air had decided to hold its breath along with me. I checked my phone one morning, not out of habit but impulse, only to find 7 missed calls, all blocked numbers, no voicemails I cared to listen to. I deleted them all without hesitation, not because I didn't care, but because I already knew what they would sound like, excuses dressed as concern. The silence after the storm was louder than anything they'd shouted in court. I passed the hallway and paused at the wall of framed photos. For decades, I'd kept snapshots of milestones, birthdays, graduations, even silly Halloween costumes. But it was the photo of Trenton at 17, arms draped over my shoulders, that caught my eye. I lifted the frame from the wall. My hands didn't shake. I didn't cry. I simply walked to the closet, wrapped the frame in a dish towel, and set it in a drawer. I wasn't erasing him. I was making room for the life I was still living. There's something about waiting for an apology you know won't come. It doesn't hurt the same way forever. It shifts, becomes a dull ache in your ribs when you breathe too deeply. I sat by the window that afternoon, remembering the version of Trenton who once promised me Christmas breakfast, even if he got married someday. The boy who cried when I missed one of his spelling bees because I was working a double shift. That boy hadn't walked into that courtroom. I didn't know who had. I started writing again, not to him, not for the court, just for myself. A letter that would never be sent, explaining that closure isn't always a sentence with a period. Sometimes it's just deciding to stop rereading the same paragraph. Later that evening, while scrolling online to check the news, I noticed something peculiar. Callista's blog was suddenly private. Her last post had been pulled down. A few of her former brand sponsors had issued quiet statements about reassessing partnerships. Junie's face, once a constant in their content, had disappeared. No one made announcements. No one issued statements. But when people start to back away slowly, it's because they've finally seen the fire behind the smoke. I didn't smile, but something in my chest loosened. 3 days later, I visited the backyard where Charlie was buried. The grass had grown thick over the plot. I brought a fresh flower, nothing fancy, just marigolds, and sat beside him on the bench I'd stained myself the summer after retirement. "I wish you'd seen it, Charlie," I whispered. I wish you'd heard her voice, saw their faces when the truth hit the room like a thunderclap. My voice cracked, not loud, not desperate, just enough to remind me I could still feel. "They didn't win," I said. "Not really." For the first time since he'd passed, I let a tear fall. It was the only one I'd needed. As night fell, I lit a candle on the porch, not for mourning, not even for memory. It was my way of saying, I'm still here. This house still stands, and so do I. 2 weeks after the ruling, I stepped into the local library and immediately noticed something had shifted. It wasn't the room, it was the people in it. An older woman near the front desk nodded at me, a slow, quiet kind of acknowledgement. I didn't know her name, but I knew that nod. It was the same one people give at funerals when they don't know what to say. Not pity, just understanding. I passed the nonfiction section, and a former student of mine, Paulie, now in his 30s, glanced up from his seat by the window. "Mrs. Duval," he said, "I saw the news." His voice was gentle. "I'm glad you spoke up." I thanked him and didn't linger. I wasn't there for attention. I just needed to feel what it was like to be somewhere again without bracing for whispers. As the days passed, the ripple of consequences started to reach places I hadn't expected. Someone sent me a screenshot from Callista's old blog. It was gone. The domain still existed, but every post now returned a 404. Her Instagram had gone private. The carefully curated image of America's favorite family had disappeared. Then word trickled in about Trenton. A neighbor told me in hushed tones that his company was reviewing his legal entanglement, and that he'd been placed on administrative leave. There were no headlines, no press releases, just quiet action, which, in some ways, spoke louder. I didn't rejoice. There's no pleasure in watching someone you raised fall. But I did take note, because actions, like people, eventually catch up with their own shadows. One morning, an envelope arrived at my door. No return address. Inside was a folded piece of pink construction paper, a crayon drawing, 2 stick figures, one taller, with a gray bun, holding hands with a smaller figure labeled me. A red heart floated above their heads. No note, no signature. But I knew the handwriting on the envelope. It was Junie's, and that drawing told me more than any apology ever could. That afternoon, I received a voicemail from Trenton. His voice was clipped, tired. I think we should talk, just the two of us. No lawyers, no drama. I listened once, then I hit delete. You don't meet the people who tried to erase you halfway. You meet yourself all the way, and that meant not going backward. The next day, my attorney called. She sounded pleased but measured, like someone trying not to show a full hand at a poker table. The judge issued a formal statement condemning the fabrication of financial records and manipulation of testimony. It won't result in criminal charges, but it's going on record. I exhaled into the phone. Thank you. They may never face legal penalties, she added, but their reputations are marked permanently. That night, I stood in my kitchen, the light above the sink casting shadows over the cup in my hand. I poured hot tea into my favorite mug, the one with a tiny chip at the rim, the one Uni gave me years ago. I stood there for a while, just breathing. I didn't win to prove them wrong. I stood tall because I remembered who I was. One morning, I set 2 plates on the table, one for me, one for habit. My hands moved before my thoughts caught up. I stood there for a second, just looking at the second plate. Then I picked it up and put it away. There was no sadness in the gesture, just the kind of quiet understanding that comes after enough time passes. Some chairs stay empty for a reason. Some don't need filling. Later that day, I opened the old wooden drawer by the hall, looking for stamps, and found a folded envelope. It was a letter I'd written but never sent, addressed to Trenton. The handwriting was mine, but the words were from a woman who'd been hurt, begging for an explanation she was never owed. I read the first line and then stopped. If you ever loved me. That's as far as I got before I tore it in 2, then 4. Then I struck a match and watched it burn in the kitchen sink. If he ever comes back, I whispered, it won't be because guilt dragged him here, and I won't be the one opening the door. That afternoon, Naomi showed up unannounced. She brought peach cobbler in a chipped glass dish and stood in the doorway like she wasn't sure she'd be let in. I did. She set the dessert on the table and sat across from me. I'm sorry, she said, before we even poured tea. I nodded. I know. We didn't talk about affidavits or court dates. We talked about the summer we snuck watermelon slices out of Aunt Myrtle's fridge. We remembered the time Trenton tried to ride Naomi's old bike and bent the frame. We spoke of uncles long gone, of family trees that forked and twisted and lost branches. Sometimes healing doesn't come head on. Sometimes it walks sideways, enters through stories, not statements. That night, I turned off my phone without checking it. I used to glance at the screen out of habit, waiting for something, an apology, an update, a miracle. But the world had grown quieter, not lonely, just less loud with expectation. I missed Junie, Some nights I let my mind wander, wondering if she still colored drawings, if she still hummed that off-key tune she'd made up for her dolls. But I didn't dwell. I just dusted off the little frame with her drawing and kept it by the window, where the light touched it gently each morning. Every evening before bed, I walked to the porch and turned on the light. Not because I was waiting, not because I expected them, but because I wasn't angry anymore. It wasn't an invitation. It was a sign. I was still here. And if one day a car pulled into that driveway and someone stood at the edge of the porch, not knowing what to say, I'd rather the light be on than not. Still, I wouldn't chase anyone. Not anymore. I was done reaching for people who never reached back. Standing by the railing that night, the wind brushing my cheek like the hand of someone I once knew, I whispered to the dark. I didn't close the door, but I did walk through a new one, and that made all the difference. The light came through the curtains in a way it hadn't for months, quiet, unrushed, not carrying the weight of anything urgent. I lay still in bed for a while, listening. No dogs barking next door, no footsteps above me, no echo of anxiety in my bones. For the first time in what felt like years, I wasn't bracing for a phone call or a lawyer's email, just the wind outside, nudging tree branches like a neighbor trying not to wake me. I got up before sunrise. The house made the usual creaks and sighs, but none of them sounded accusing. In the kitchen, I brewed coffee, not because I needed it, but because I wanted to hear the percolation. There was no court date circled on the calendar, no envelope waiting at the door, only the soft hum of a day that belonged entirely to me. Later, I went upstairs and pulled out the quilt I'd started when Uni was born, half finished. The thread had tangled once, and I'd packed it away, convinced I'd return to it when life was less chaotic. Today, I set it out on the dining table and smoothed the edges. I didn't stitch quickly. I didn't need to. Some things we mend for ourselves, not to gift, not to prove anything, just because they deserve finishing. By early afternoon, I walked into the community center for the weekly book club. A woman named Ruth smiled when she saw me. I didn't know her well, but we'd chatted about books the week before, how we both hated endings that tied everything up too neatly. I sat between her and a man named Carl, who brought lemon cookies every time. They didn't ask me about the trial, didn't mention Trenton or Callista or the media attention. They knew me as Marcel, just Marcel, and for once, that was more than enough. After the meeting, I stopped by the garden plot I'd signed up for at the city lot. My hands moved instinctively, planting small clusters of thyme and basil into the soil. The woman tending the bed next to mine asked if I was new in town. I smiled. In some ways, yes. She laughed, said she liked that answer, then asked if I needed help spreading mulch. I declined, but thanked her anyway. When I got home, I walked past the hallway where the family photo wall used to be. Most of the frames were still in a box in the garage, but one remained, a quote in a frame I hadn't dusted since last fall. Family means no one gets left behind. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I took it down and replaced it with something I'd found on a note card at a craft fair. Home is where you're allowed to be whole. It felt better, lighter. That evening, I lit a candle, not because of tradition, but because I liked the way the flame danced. I didn't think about who might call or whether Trenton ever would. I didn't need to. I didn't get the apology. I didn't get the family back, but I got something better, myself. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of ending a mother like me deserves. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that silence doesn't always mean weakness, and walking away doesn't mean defeat. Sometimes the greatest act of strength is choosing yourself, even when those closest to you try to rewrite your worth. To anyone watching who's ever felt erased, dismissed, or used by the people they loved the most, you are not alone. You have the right to draw your line, to protect your peace, and to define what family means on your terms. Have you ever been pushed to a point where you had to choose between family and self-respect? I'd love to hear your story. Drop a comment, press 1 if this resonated with you, or tell me where you're watching from. If you didn't connect with this video, I respect that too. Let me know why and where you're tuning in. And if this story moved you, if it stirred something in your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I've got more real stories coming your way. Let's keep healing and growing together.